I do not understand a word you said. Yeah, it's it's like it really helps. Press the button first, then start speaking. You're one of these people who halfway into the first word is when you fit the button fully, which is hilarious. But then I don't understand what you're saying. That's awesome.
In der Mitte des Stuhls zu bleiben. Wir versuchen, du bewegst dich leicht.
Okay, great, thank you.
Irgendwie zu fixen.
Wie fixen?
Na, so, dass du...
Ich soll mich nicht bewegen, oder was?
Ja, nein, vielleicht nicht so viel.
Da, nach da?
Nicht bewegen. Keine Tanzschuhe.
Ah, okay. Righty ho.
Welcome to DW News. This is a YouTube Live. My name is Alex Forrest Whiting, and we are going to be talking today for a special Q&A on the G7 summit, which is being held in Bavaria in Germany, and that's because Germany currently holds the G7 presidency. Now, of course, all of this comes off the back of the war in Ukraine, which has had repercussions across the globe with food prices rising, with, of course, energy costs rising as well, and even talk of a possible global recession. Joining me here in this little glass box in Berlin, I've got Jörg Forbrig, who is the Director of Central and Eastern Europe at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having
and
me.
talking to me and helping me out with this. And also in Bavaria at the G7 summit, we have our own chief political editor, that is Michaela Küfner, and she is in the most gorgeous setting. Well, actually, it's not so gorgeous. I can see in the background there, Michaela. Is it? Can I see it behind
Because
you?
it's the mountains
Sort of.
and the weather's turned sour. So.
Very nice to have you. Thanks so much for chatting to us, Michaela. It's great to have you on. Also, everyone, if you want to get in touch with us, please do. Please use the chat on YouTube. Put your messages in, any questions that you've got for the guests, and I will endeavour to ask them and get through as many as possible. I can't promise we will get to them all. Also, please keep them nice and friendly, because we can't ask anything that's not. Before we go on, just let me tell you about the G7. It's made up of 7 countries: Germany, the US, France, the UK, Italy, Japan, Canada, and also the EU, which is like a special member. It's not actually part officially of the G7, but they join in. And also, I think Michaela will tell us more about this later, but there are these special partners that Germany has invited to this G7 summit, which include India, also Indonesia, Senegal, and a few others as well. So they are also playing a very key role in all of this. But we really have to start by talking about Ukraine, because this whole G7 summit is set against that backdrop. Everything seems to come back to Ukraine at the moment. And this morning, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed G7 leaders. He did that via video link. And he called for tougher sanctions. He called for also more arms. And most importantly, the thing that really struck everybody, I think, was that he asked for or hoped that there would be an end to the war by Christmas. So I wanted to ask you, Jörg Forbrig, do you think that that is realistic? Could there possibly an end to this war, which has gone on for several months now, by the winter, by the end of the winter, the end of this year?
Well, first of all, I think everything is possible. We have already seen predictions that Ukraine would falter quickly under this assault by what is the second biggest military in the world. Ukraine has surprised us from day one of this Russian war against Ukraine. So I wouldn't rule anything out. Zelensky certainly also didn't mean to predict here. I think he basically raised a possibility. He basically said that provided certain conditions, provided strong support by the democracies of the world, by the West, there is a chance for this war to end quickly. Now, this obviously basically passes the baton to those meeting in Elmo, because there has to be stronger military support first and foremost to Ukraine, because over the last couple of weeks we have seen that Russia is now playing out its advantages, the very sort of asymmetry of this being a huge army, and this is what makes it very, very hard for Ukraine to keep up its defenses. But this is obviously a call for stronger support. This is something that leaders in Elmo will also consider. This is something that sort of has to be basically sped up. There has to be more robust military support, and then indeed Ukraine may find itself in a position where it can defend itself more effectively, and where it puts Russia in a position by the end of this year to agree to some form of, be it a truce, be it some form of a way of managing this conflict. So much here depends on the West, on international support for Ukraine. But if that support is not provided as robustly as President Zelensky demands it, then, of course, this will be a very long, drawn-out conflict, and eventually Russia will be in a position to dictate its own terms for some form of settlement.
Well, let's just go to Michaela here, because you are obviously at the G7, and we know that some offers have been made and promises have been made by members of the G7. First of all, how did Zelensky go down at the summit? What was the reaction from people there?
Well, first of all, I mean, he was given a remarkable amount of time. There were 2 hours, that's as long as leaders took to talk about the state of the global economy. And it just shows what a central concern Ukraine, and particularly also the fallout from that conflict, is for absolutely everybody. And what was just mentioned there, some kind of settlement, well, from what we've learned, that's exactly what Volodymyr Zelensky is warning of, that now is not the time to try and sit down with Russia's President Putin, who doesn't want to discuss anything particularly at the moment anyway, but despite continued reassurances that there won't be any kind of reaching out, any kind of suggestion of settlement over the head of Ukraine, German Chancellor Scholz has stressed that time and time again. Also, the US President Biden, it's Volodymyr Zelensky who really appealed to G7 leaders to step up their support, and we also know that the Americans are currently exploring the idea, and it's actually getting more concrete as we speak, to actually buy a further defense, a surface-to-air defense system for the Ukrainians, and to basically bolster their defenses so they don't lose more territory, because that is what's happening at the moment. And we've also seen the first rocket attacks in weeks on Kiev as the G7 sat down. So you can read into something into that or not, but it is a remarkable coincidence, and it is also seen as an attack on the unity of the G7, with President Biden here vowing and everybody that they will, and that's what all leaders signed off on essentially in their joint statement, they will continue support Ukraine for as long as necessary. We all remember Mario Draghi saving the euro, saying we'll do whatever it takes. Well, now he's Italian Prime Minister, and one does wonder whether it was his sentence in that particular statement.
A lovely link there.
Symbolism here, giving him that much time, it's very unusual.
You know, this also comes off the back of Russia defaulting on its foreign sovereign bonds. I know that the Kremlin has denied that. Does that mean that sanctions are working, Jörg? Does that mean that, you know, actually stuff is happening?
Well, I think it's one indication. It's the latest, perhaps, indication that sanctions are working now. 6 sanctions packages have been launched since February to punish Russia for its actions in Ukraine. There is much debate about how sanctions can be effective, whether they work at all. Whom do you also target with sanctions? So, I mean, this is an unprecedented sort of series of sanctions that's been rolled out. I don't think there has been one of those in history, really. But obviously, everybody's waiting for the effects of that. Of those sanctions. Now, one thing about sanctions is they take effect with a certain delay, because with many of these punitive measures, you have grace periods, you have a certain implementation time, and I think many people, we're now in month number 5 of this war. Many people are getting a little restless, a little nervous about whether the measures will actually take an effect, and I think by now we see effects. We see it both inside of Russia. We see it coming out of the Kremlin. In the last couple of days, we had some of those indications, not only this technical default today that we observed, but also a week ago when Lithuania started implementing EU sanctions, there was a very angry reaction from the Kremlin. So this is clearly something that bites.
And just to pick up on that, that was about Lithuania saying that Russia was not allowed to export its goods that were under sanctions to its Russian state right on the Baltic.
Yes, this is basically about a transfer of goods within Russian territory from mainland Russia to the exclave of Kaliningrad. But for that transport, the territory of Lithuania is critical, because that's where the railway lines run through. So in principle, this is internal transport in Russia, but because it's using international territory, the EU and Lithuania as the state in question here, the transit state, is obviously in its perfect right to implement those sanctions. Now, when it comes to the default today, this is a direct effect of sanctions that have been implemented many weeks ago, because Russia may have the money to pay back those or to make those interest payments to international investors, but has no way of making the payments because its banking system is basically excluded from the international financial system. So this is not a sanction in the sense that Russia is running out of money, but it has no technical way of payment. And technically, that is a default.
And, you know, just while we're talking about sanctions, we're going to talk a little bit more, for example, about energy and some of those issues. But Michaela, one of the things that did come out, or has so far come out on, from the G7, are restrictions on Russian gold, and that seemed to be quite significant when that was announced.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, this technical default you were just talking about, that is essentially those countries that are imposing sanctions, the classic West and beyond, scoring a point against Russia, which is actually earning more money on energy at the moment because of the crisis over Ukraine. Energy prices have gone up, so Russia is now actually earning more money through gas and oil by exporting less. And this is really a huge challenge here. And that's also partly why sanctions continue to be widened. It's stressed here that this technical default shows that the sanctions, excluding Russia from the banking system, from SWIFT as well, is working. At the same time, gold exports by Russia are supposed to be barred. I'm saying supposed to be because this is all in the statement, but there are no concrete new measures that are announced and how they will be technically implemented. So it's more kind of that all sides say this is what they want to do. Also, they want to tackle the supply chain, exclude Russia even further when it comes to military goods and services. So it will be interesting how that is technically implemented. And the list of individuals targeted will get longer according to this document, and that also includes, it's pointed particularly at people who may be involved in war crimes or planning war crimes. Also a huge stress here, and this is also points to the G7 being not like the G20, all about the economics, but also about values, that there won't be impunity for those crimes committed. That is very much stressed in that statement, and that the G7, even once this war is over, won't simply let the atrocities go that have already been committed there.
Very interesting. Thank you, Michaela. And just picking up on that, because you are watching a YouTube live. We are DW News, and we are talking about the G7 summit. And I have asked people to please give us some of your questions, your points. And we have had one here from Marek Kolenda, who says, and maybe this is for you, Jörg, Russia can bypass gold sales, talking about those, the sanctions on gold. Russia can bypass gold sales restrictions by going to Saudi Arabia, China, or the Indian gold market. I mean, just look at, for example, what's happened with oil, which we'll talk a bit about later. But we know, for example, that China now, in May, took more oil, crude oil, from Russia than from Saudi Arabia. So, as Michaela is saying, you know, they're not doing as badly as perhaps many countries, particularly those in the G7, would have wanted.
Well, that's certainly correct, because, I mean, sanctions or the imposition of sanctions is one thing. And then, obviously, the very monitoring, the application is another. And this is where, obviously, we see already that sanctions are not easy to fully implement. You can declare them, but then the implementation is what makes it difficult. And Russia will certainly always find ways to bypass at least some of the sanctions. And I think it's pointed out perfectly correctly in the questions that gold, for instance, lends itself to bypassing sanctions relatively easily, because no major infrastructure is required. With gas, for instance, a very contentious bone also in this country, you would be much more effective declaring sanctions because you can't easily recreate the infrastructure elsewhere. So in that sense, I think the key to sanctions generally is in the the implementation by a broadest possible coalition also of countries worldwide. I think part of the reason why a number of non-G7 members have been, or countries have been invited to Elmo, is also to see how you can broaden the coalition of countries that will not deal with Russia and help it effectively to bypass sanctions. So I think this is something where we already see that as the old West, as Europe, the United States, and a number of global allies, that we as a group of countries aren't enough to effectively implement many of these sanctions, but we need the help of many other countries.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Particularly, Michaela, I wanted to talk to you about that, you know, the big infrastructure project that's been promised. But just before we get onto that, there has been criticism of Germany and particularly of Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And have they done enough? You know, we talked about gas. We've talked about whether they, you know, heavy weapons have not getting through until certainly very recently. Do you think it's fair, that criticism on Germany?
Well, I think it is, absolutely. I mean, first of all, the war is still on. Hundreds are dying every day. Clearly, none of us have done enough. So whichever country we look at. But clearly, some countries have done more than others. There are the Baltic states, there are Poland, the United States. Germany, in absolute terms, has mustered support for Ukraine on the order of about 2.5 billion euros. That puts it on number 5, I think, in a ranking. But if you look at sort of contributions or aid to Ukraine relative to a country's GDP, then Germany is on number 14. Mm-hmm. So I think the expectation to Germany here is that this is a political heavyweight. This is an economic powerhouse. There must be more that this country can do in financial terms, in humanitarian terms, and of course also in military terms to support Ukraine. And I think Germany has fallen short of the expectations, also by many in this country. If you look at public opinion polls in this country, there's a very, very strong support for more robust support to Ukraine. So I think that that criticism is something that is very, very justified, and fingers crossed it will lead to some reorientation also of German assistance policy broadly to Ukraine.
And yet, Michaela, at the G7, we know that there was a bilateral yesterday between Joe Biden, the US president, and also Chancellor Scholz. We'll talk about that in a second, but I think we can just hear a bit of that discussion. It was almost off the cuff, some comments that Joe Biden was making to Chancellor Scholz. Let's just have a listen.
I think we can get through all this.
Yeah.
And come out stronger.
And the good message is that we all made it to stay united, which obviously Putin never expected.
And that was in no small part because of you. No small part because of you. Seriously.
Yeah.
Because there was a lot of discussion of whether or not in the transition, well, how it's going to work. But you've done an incredible job. I want to thank you for it.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. We have to stay together.
Yeah.
Because Putin has been counting on from the beginning. And somehow NATO would, and the G7 would splinter, but we haven't, and we're not going to. So we can't let this aggression take the form it has and get away with it.
Michaela, I mean, really incredible praise there from President Biden, his hand on Chancellor Scholz's arm. Thank you, he kept saying. Was this very important for Scholz to have that from Biden, for the world to hear it after all that criticism, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's more than good for UCV to get the US president to praise the leadership. I mean, there's clearly welcome words there for Chancellor Scholz, who, yes, has been criticized in Germany a lot as well over what was perceived to be hesitancy, although Joe Biden knows full well in what a poor state the German military still is, and that was also the argument given by Germany all that time. And so he clearly felt, I think it was interesting that he also signaled that there were some doubts during that time of transition. He means the transition from Angela Merkel to her former vice-chancellor, now Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So it's kind of, yes, it is a huge compliment, but someone telling you, well, we did have a few doubts, you know, how this is going to work out, but he really did a great job. There is a lot of criticism, but I just want to add to that there are also polls in Germany that show that this hesitancy, you know, that has been criticized internationally, and there is really evidence that Germany could have moved faster on some deliveries, is something that Germans don't overall see as completely negative. 2/3 of Germans, according to one poll, and we don't want to be doing too much poll trading here, didn't feel that he was too hesitant. So the German public is very cautious. And Angela Merkel gave an interview recently where she said, you know, she always looked for a way to, if we can't be partners with Russia, to at least cohabitate. That's what she said. And Germans don't want to get sucked into this conflict. Very different attitude from, for instance, Poland, the former Soviet countries, the Baltics, of course, who are the direct neighbors of Russia, who don't need any explanation as to how threatening this could be for them. So it clearly took a much longer time to arrive as an issue here in Germany that really is Germany's business as well. So Olaf Scholz really does represent public sentiment to a very large degree there, according to some polling that has been done. And Joe Biden, now singling him out, gives also his attempts to continue the dialogue with Vladimir Putin that has been criticized for Poland, for instance, fresh validation. And Olaf Scholz won't say that, but Angela Merkel did say that recently in an interview, that there was a sense of also a division of roles towards Russia, that it is France and Germany doing the talking, doing the diplomacy, and the more robust kind of threatening scenario was more done and clearly is being done by the Americans, who by far are spending the most and sending the most when it comes to heavy weapons to Ukraine. But clearly a very welcome compliment for Olaf Scholz. And just 2 days before that, it was the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who praised his German counterpart, Germany's Foreign Minister Baerbock, for great leadership. So clearly a concerted American effort there to boost Germany's leadership role.
Fascinating, isn't it? I mean, just in terms of really trying to push that onto the agenda so that the world knows and the world can see that the US is absolutely standing beside Germany with that. But just going back to what we were talking about there about, you know, states being concerned, you talked about also hesitancy, of course, in Germany about getting too involved in this and sending heavy weapons. We've got a question here from Simon Marshall, who says, shouldn't the G7 accept that Ukraine is entitled to hit military targets within Russia to erode their supply line, so that at the very least? I don't know whether, Michaela, you can answer that, or whether Jörg, you would like to. Michaela, are you happy to, or would you?
Depends on how, well, it depends on how. There's actually a very simple but also very complicated answer to this. Under international law, Ukraine is entitled to defend itself by any means. But there is a clearly communicated conditionality for the support by its Western allies, without whom it would be lost, essentially. That if it were, and particularly by the Americans, that it must not, certainly with US weapons, but it must not hit targets within Russia. And if that happens with American or any kind of NATO weapons, and I dare say any other weapon, if Ukraine conducts a war that takes a war onto Russian territory, and NATO countries are bolstering Ukraine at the same time, that creates a position that could shift us a great deal closer to, and yes, I will say it, World War III, because that is how dramatic this situation can quickly become. So there is no appetite for this. NATO has stressed, all NATO countries have stressed time and time again that they will not get involved. From the German perspective, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, wherever he goes, continues to stress that Germany will be no party in this conflict. So there's a very simple answer. Yes, Ukraine could do it under international law, but then there's reality.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Jörg, did you want to add to that?
To add to that, a couple of pieces, perhaps also nuances. One is Ukraine is already hitting targets in Russia. We have footage of attacks on refineries. We have enough news about explosions that are basically where it's insinuated that this must have been Ukraine.
So it's under the radar, though. It's nobody's saying it out loud.
Exactly. So I think we already have some of those attacks, and they're critical, of course, for Ukraine because these are supply lines. These are often not far from the official border between Russia and Ukraine. They are within reach for Ukrainian kamikaze attacks. So we've seen some of this already. But it's certainly right that at the moment this is about the defense of Ukraine, and the weaponry is to be used for defensive purposes. This is not about going beyond the bounds of Ukraine. The problem is only where are they? Because in the Russian view, an attack on Crimean targets will be an attack on Russian territory. Much the same will probably go for parts of the separatist entities in eastern Ukraine. So where do you actually draw this line? There's a huge grey zone in all of that. But for the time being, this is not probably even the primary question. At the moment, this is about supporting Ukraine to defend its position where it holds them. It's not even that much about advancing Ukrainian positions and pushing back Russia. But I completely agree that Ukraine here has to tread very, very carefully, because we may very quickly see that as Ukraine becomes better equipped, therefore more effective in pushing back Russian advances, and perhaps also pushing Russia back from some of the territories that it holds, this will have an impact on the debate in our societies. This is very sensitive, I think, for Ukraine then to judge how far it can actually go without jeopardizing some of the support that it has in defending itself.
Yeah, and it still needs that unity, which we talked about before, and which we also saw President Biden mentioning the word unity, and we talked about needing not just the G7 but other countries, which brings me onto you, Michaela, because I mentioned earlier that it's not just the G7 member states who are attending this summit, but also some other countries as well. And we've got India, for example, Indonesia, South Africa, and the G7 has already talked about committing $600 billion to a global infrastructure fund to combat, in particular, it appears, you can tell us more about this, but China's Belt and Road Scheme. Before I ask you specifically about that, let's just listen to Ursula von der Leyen. She's the head of the European Commission, of course. She was talking about what the EU has put into this fund as well, which seems to be quite a lot, 300 billion. Let's just hear from her, and then Michaela, I just want to unpack this a bit with you.
Europe is mobilizing 300 billion euros till 2027 over the next 7 years from both public and private sources. 300 billion euros for sustainable quality infrastructure and also for health infrastructure. Investments that are transparent and that improve everyday lives and bring real benefit for the communities on the ground.
So what do you make of this huge amount of money, Michaela? I mean, it sounds absolutely enormous, but is it all that it seems? Is it new? Have we heard this before?
And that was the purpose, that it was supposed to sound absolutely huge. China's Belt and Road is more near $1 trillion. This actually goes back to a discussion already at the last G7 gathering, and now it has its chapter heading, so to say, as this international infrastructure program, where Joe Biden also, who announced $200 billion coming from the American side. Again, this is public and private money being used for dozens of projects he says are already underway. Well, what this really is, it is stretching out the hand of the traditional West to other regions in the world. You already mentioned the partner countries here. India, the most important one. Narendra Modi here. Senegal also, which currently heads the African Union. Argentina is here to represent Latin America. And also Indonesia, a key country in Asia. Now, most of these countries abstained when it came to condemning Russia at the United Nations. And it is really about swaying them or explaining to them why there is a reason to stick with the West, or to be conscious of the democratic structure, because it's only democracies that were invited here. Olaf Scholz continued to stress that. I was with him on the Africa trip where he went to Senegal and South Africa, and he also learned there that to these countries, the effects of the war are very much arriving in terms of soaring energy costs, inflation, and the threat of potential food shortages. At the same time, Ukraine is a faraway country somewhere in Europe for them. So, and they need Russia and they need China. And they're also, in the case of South Africa and India, in the so-called BRICS system, that is another club of emerging economies where they actually sit in the same room and at the table with China and Russia to discuss constructively what they can do for each other. And that has also led to India not just abstaining, but also benefiting from the impact of the Ukraine war. It is buying gas and oil. It is licensing Russian ships to help export Russian energy. And the G7 really needs to give, particularly India, a reason to side with these traditional Western countries. Here we see Narendra Modi arriving, of course, that being a key country, the largest democracy in the world. Now, if you can't get the largest democracy to side with you on something essential like this breach of international law, this war of aggression, and then you're really in trouble with what you're aiming for, the multilateralism Olaf Scholz and the G7 stand for. And that's what this infrastructure program is about, to demonstrate that this is not about bolstering the global economy for the continuing wealth of the already rich countries, but that the G7 really mean it when they say they want to help with infrastructure, and that they can offer a better deal than China, where Ursula von der Leyen so stressed that where China is, you may have infrastructure, but no jobs remain, and everybody is, the countries are in debt. And indeed, there has been a learning curve in some countries that may now welcome the West being more engaged. Now, 600 billion, that is a lot of money, but it's still significantly less than China is willing to put on the table for its Belt and Road program.
I mean, it sounds like a fantastic, can I say it, bribe to those countries. Do you think, Jörg, that it would make a difference to them? Do you think that they might decide that actually they will go with the West? Perhaps they will at some point criticise Russia. For example, India, will it criticise Russia over Ukraine? South Africa, the others that Michaela was talking about. Do you think it will make a difference?
Well, I don't think it has a direct relationship immediately to their positioning vis-à-vis Russia over its war in Ukraine. I think for this you would have to take a different approach. I mean, you would have to much more consciously also target individual countries with investment partnerships and so forth. So. I wouldn't also immediately sort of put it in the category of this is the West trying to buy the votes of a number of countries, as it were, because this is something that is long overdue. China has been rolling out a massive, almost global investment program for, I mean, a decade almost. It's made inroads in Africa with infrastructure development, always obviously also in relation to the exploitation of natural resources there. It's built basically a web of infrastructure projects from Southeast Asia all the way to Europe. This also happens on our doorstep. So I think it was high time that we come up with something, or with a first step, let's say, to give countries options to say, you can take Chinese money, but you can also work with us on hopefully fairer conditions. So I think it's a catch-up rather than an immediate response to the Russian war in Ukraine.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Just if you are joining us, my name is Alex Forrest Whiting. This is a YouTube live stream. It's a Q&A. We're talking about the G7 summit, which is being held in Germany, in Bavaria, in fact. And we are talking about, it's all sort of focused around Ukraine and the effects of that, but we're talking about what's coming out of that summit. It won't end until tomorrow, so we're halfway through, I suppose 2/3 of the way through. Michaela, when we were talking about that infrastructure project, and you were talking about these partner countries that are also at the summit, and you mentioned South Africa, you mentioned also Senegal. Now, that's quite interesting when we were talking about the food price issue, because we know that the chair of the Africa Union, Macky Sall, met President Putin a few weeks ago to talk about that whole issue of escalating food prices, and that it becoming a real concern across many parts of the country. And it seemed to he seemed to come back saying actually it was down to sanctions. That was the problem with that. Mm-hmm. But it is a problem because we know that there are, 25 million tons of grain stuck in the Ukraine that can't get out, and there are people and countries that are going hungry. Sorry, Michaela,
yes,
I just was saying that. Just wondering if there was any reaction to that.
Well, yes, I just want to put this into a context as well, because I think it was very important what Jörg was saying about the long overdue and reaching out to these countries. Well, this was all supposed to be in a greater framework of climate neutrality. This is what Olaf Scholz wanted his G7, the German G7 presidency, to be about, is to encourage countries like Senegal, like South Africa, and help them invest in cleaner technology. And now this has all become part of also a response under this huge G7 umbrella of action to keep democracies on their side. Now, Olaf Scholz knew that Macky Sall, as African Union president, of course, had the mandate to go and speak to Vladimir Putin, because this is a question of the very survival of people in very poor countries, and hunger, it is feared, also has the potential, to put it mildly and bluntly, and at the same time, to destabilize countries across the world, because it is such an essential issue. And every expert I've spoken to really doesn't want to think about the implications if those between 22 and 25 million tons of grain don't leave that port of Mariupol, because it is essential. And so this is a point that was, as I learned, made a lot of times behind the scenes, that there's a continuous outreach by G7 countries to talk to leaders who are in touch with Vladimir Putin, who tries to tell them that this is all because of the sanctions, all this hardship is the product of Western sanctions, that this is really because of the war, that these are implications of the war and not something that is punishment for Russia and is now starting to punish other states. So this just shows what kind of geopolitical battle this really is, because it can't be more essential and more basic than food security, also energy security. The very livelihoods of these countries most affected. Sudan is another one where this really many lives hang in the balance, not to mention Yemen, because of this crisis. So it is a struggle for the truth, and the fact that a country like Senegal engages with both sides, I think they don't have any other option, and they should. That's what, and the West has to make an offer there.
And we have got a little graphic that we can show you now, which just shows how prices for vegetable oil, for cereals, for also dairy have changed. The scale of what we're talking about, particularly look at the oil, that's the yellow one, as it's getting higher and higher, and it's right up there. So it is a real problem. And you know, this is Ukraine, isn't it, that is supposed to be exporting vegetable oil, for example. Can't get it out, can't get this grain out, stuck. Do you think that we will see that released? Will we be able to get it out, or is this just part of the war and we're just going to have to deal with it?
Well, I'm very skeptical here because the Kremlin, whether from the outset or in the sort of course of developments, discovered that it can basically hold the world hostage with these, especially these grain supplies. Oil, somewhat lesser of lesser importance, but grain in particular. And I don't quite see how the Kremlin would give up that pressure point. They would want to have something in exchange for it. And at the moment, I can't see what kind of concessions Ukraine in particular, and also we all of us would be able to make in order for Russia to release those supplies. Now, even if they were released now, if there was a way to somehow get these huge amounts of grain out of Ukraine, we will also have a problem going forward, because for the foreseeable future, Ukraine will not have the same harvests that it had in the past, in part because agricultural areas are impacted by the war, are contaminated with weaponry, unexploded devices, and so on. So I think there is a number of years here that we're really looking at before this situation can return to normal, provided that the situation in Ukraine allows for that. And at the moment, there's no indication for it. So I really don't see a way out here at all, to be honest.
So, Michaela, did anything positive come out of the G7? Were there any concrete plans of how they could make sure that that grain, for example, was going to get out of Ukraine, or was it just more talk and more hope, and, as you say, using perhaps other countries who are still on good relations with Putin?
Well, as we're live here on YouTube, the discussion on global food security was actually extended. It took longer than was originally scheduled with those partner countries. So no surprise there with the African Union sitting at the table. When one knows that, according to UN figures, some 55 million people go to bed hungry every day in Africa. Countries like Tunisia, for instance, they get 80% of their wheat from Ukraine. 80%, an entire country. In the case, and let me just cite another country here, in Lebanon, it's 80% from Russia and Ukraine together. Russia is also a significant exporter of grain to the world. And now, so unfortunately, there's no statement on this. It will be very interesting to see what is in the final communique on this, but it's an issue that was discussed for more than 2 hours, also together with the leaders of the global institutions there at the table, and the UN Secretary General was in a virtual meeting with G7 leaders on that. But we do expect significant, that's what I learned before, significant sums of money to be pledged to help alleviate the situation. But whatever it is, it can be a bridge, but to what? Food security is needed for the long term, and we almost forget that 2 years of pandemic already increased the pressure, increased hunger worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. A very good point. And you did, of course, there mention Russia, because we've been talking about Ukraine and that, you know, they've been called the breadbasket of Europe, at least. But you mentioned Russia, and we've got a question here from Lucian Annandale. Why are we so dependent on everything from Russia? Obviously not just talking about food, but also oil, gas. Can't other countries provide these essentials, or is Russia the world provider of everything? This system of dependence is really bad, with bad, B-A-D, capital exclamation mark. I mean, it's a good point, isn't it? That's what we've seen over the past few months with this war, that we have been so dependent, with many people not even knowing it. But fertilizer, for example, dependent on Russia.
Mm-hmm. Not only, though. There are obviously other producers of wheat, of fertilizers, of oil and gas in the world. I think the mistake that we have made, and in particular also this country, Germany, is that it has placed too many of its bets on one country. It's basically not hedged sufficiently against those risks. It is the last 20 years that basically drove us into an energy dependency on Russia, and to sort of find a way out of that dependency is very hard and will be very painful and quite costly. But then Russia is not a country that produces all that many things. It just employs all the things that it does produce to create dependencies, to then basically also have pressure points on others. I mean, the energy exports are obviously most important. Something like wheat, grain, we didn't have on our screens for a very long time. But the few things that Russia produces in large quantities, it clearly employs for political gain. And this is obviously where we also have to wonder if there aren't other countries that are large grain producers, wheat producers. The United States, Canada, cannot step in at least to at least partially alleviate that situation. I personally haven't seen any mention of that.
No, that is a good point. We haven't seen any mention of that. If you're joining us, you are watching a YouTube live Q&A. We're talking about the G7 summit, which is being held in Bavaria because Germany has the G7 presidency at the moment. And we're talking about some of the issues that have spiralled out of this war in Ukraine that, of course, is dominating the whole discussion of the G7. We were talking about food crisis, but also energy. And we talked there about how some countries, for example, Germany, we're sitting in Berlin here, how Germany has been very dependent on Russia, particularly for energy. And in fact, at the end of last week, we had the German economy and energy minister, Robert Habeck, who called it a weapon of war. That's what he accused Russia of doing over energy, and put Germany on a war footing over energy. So we'll talk about that in a moment, but let's just hear what he has to say. Hopefully. Can we hear Robert Habeck?
We have a disruption of the gas supply, which is why it is necessary to declare this emergency gas plan. Gas is from now on in short supply in Germany.
Ist von nun an ein knappes Gut in Deutschland. Wir sind also jetzt gehalten.
We are now called on to reduce gas consumption already during the summer and looking ahead towards winter. It is surely a deceptive reality we are currently in. Summer is here, a summer after a long period of the pandemic, and people want to enjoy time outside and maybe without political misery for once. But winter will arrive.
Ohne politische Trübsal im Kopf die Zeit genießen, aber der Winter wird ja kommen.
So winter is coming. I mean, it's pretty tough from him. Dr. Jörg Forbrig from the German Marshall Fund, what did you make of that? Because it seemed a big moment at the end of last week when suddenly Germans were being told, and those of us who live in Germany were being told, you've got to really start thinking about consuming energy because winter is coming and this could only get worse.
I would say I wasn't that surprised. Perhaps I mean much is being made of that move and the announcement, but Minister Habeck has been sort of very clear about some of these effects for a long time. I think there is a very strong communications part to that ministry in particular. At the same time, there's a sort of a very strong effort coming out of that ministry in particular to fix at least those things that can be fixed relatively quickly. If we think of the entire oil debate, Russia is basically, or Germany is basically weaning itself off Russian oil relatively fast, but with gas it's much more difficult. So what I appreciate here is the openness. I mean, there's very strong communication here. I would wish that other parts of the German government would be doing the same with their sort of portfolios. But I think there's a clear warning. This is the latest, but not the first. That we are looking at a very difficult situation in I mean later this year and in the winter. I think this was also sort of meant in particular as a strong signaling to German industry, because this is where I think they are the concerns are riding very high, that we may be sliding into a very serious economic crisis on the back of this. But this has been, or this communication or these warnings by the economy minister, they have been a constant feature over the last couple of weeks. I think that is the right approach to take. You do need to prepare publics and also business and the entire society that a difficult situation is upon us. So in that sense, I was not that surprised actually by the announcement.
I'd like to just bring in our chief political editor. When I say our, I mean DW's chief political editor, Michaela Küfner. Obviously, you are immersed in German politics. You know everything that's going on. What was your take on those statements by Robert Habeck at the end of last week about that and about warning people actually and putting them on this so-called war footing?
Well, it was a very difficult statement for him to make, also against the backdrop of those gas depots here in Germany. A lot of them are in Russian ownership. Germany has essentially taken control of the largest one of them in a caretaker function. And he then said that gas is being used as a weapon directly against Germany. This because the pressure level dropped so significantly in the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. With Nord Stream 2 won't go online, but Nord Stream 1 is that gas lifeline that is pumping a huge chunk of Germany's and Europe's oil supplies into the system, essentially. And Germany is also bound by contract to support its European partners. So there is a great sense of unity there, but having to break to the German public that this is now really hitting them and that they will feel it potentially every day is very difficult for a minister, and even worse, actually, for a Green minister, is that he also sees himself in a position where he has to use coal out of all energy methods over the summer to save as much gas, because that is needed for the winter, so people can heat their buildings and industry can continue to produce. Many industries heavily reliant on gas, and it just highlights really the complexity, but also how dramatic the situation really is. And he is also someone who very early on said, look, if we weaken ourselves, if we weaken our economy, we won't be in a position to be a strong partner for Ukraine. So that's the kind of catch-22 Germany, but also Europe is finding itself in.
We'll talk about coal in a moment, Michaela, because I want us to play a very short video that you yourself did talking about Germany and what's happening with coal. But one thing that has been discussed at the G7, which hopefully you can tell us a bit more about, is the possibility of a price cap, particularly on oil, Russian oil. Can you fill us in on that and tell us what it means and what they're trying to do and whether there will be agreement?
Yeah, what they're trying to do is to create the following outcome, which is to stop Russia actually making more money by being sanctioned because prices are going up so sharply. And that can only really be done if at least most of the world takes part in this, because otherwise they will simply just sell elsewhere. And that is a very complex undertaking. And as I'm hearing right now, out of that meeting, there are still different views on that. So it is a proposal that particularly the US is pushing here. And we don't know whether that will actually, at this point in time, whether that will truly come to an agreement or be mentioned as a tool, as a potential outcome in the final communiqué.
Thank you. Did you want to add something to that, Jörg?
What I would say is that this entire question basically brings us back to what we discussed earlier on already, that in order for sanctions on a country like Russia to be effective, you need the largest possible global coalition.
Yeah.
You basically need to prevent countries from taking advantage here that Russia offers oil at steep discounts in order to shift it onto world markets. So here again, I think this is a huge task of coalition building.
Yeah.
Basically, it's not only a technical or legal implementation of a sanction, but it's very much a political alliance that you need to create in order to have these sanctions encompass as much of Russia's potential market as possible.
And difficult when you've got countries like India, which we know are big importers of these some of these commodities, particularly from Russia. So the talks, I guess, will be continuing, Michaela, in the hope that maybe something will come of that, and India might think differently. Doesn't sound like that will happen, though, does it?
Well, India doesn't. I mean, India doesn't doesn't have anything to gain. Let's put it this way. By implementing sanctions and siding with Europe and the United States on this, because Ukraine and that conflict is just simply so far away. And you were talking about bribing. I really don't think it's as simple as that. India will go, and it's more than a billion people now. India has to find a way and that matches its own interests. And the G7 are working very hard here as we speak to really give India enough reason to seek a partnership with the countries that are sitting around the table here. And if that means taking a stance against Russia, well, that would have to be a very, very good continuous long-term offer into the future. That won't just be a sum put on the table. And at the moment, India is benefiting from these sanctions, and it actually is in a better place for not implementing sanctions against Russia because it has little to gain from that. Although what we do understand is that India has understood, and Narendra Modi is quite clear who is the perpetrator here. I mean, even China actually has been mildly critical that it doesn't necessarily approve borders being shifted, but it won't act against Russia. It may be displeased quietly, but it won't condemn Russia. And that's really the kind of international diplomacy that's going on, but that's also interest politics. And that, in the end, always comes down to business.
Absolutely. Very, very interesting about India, of course, and you mentioned there China, that's its big rival. And I guess that's what the G7 knows, and so they are trying to, as much as possible, make sure that India is looking to them. India needs to make sure it has its allies as well, but that's probably for another day. You did talk about coal, Michaela, and we're obviously all tied up with climate. We were talking about how that was supposed to be so much part of this G7 summit, and how countries could start really trying to tackle the issue of climate. Let's just look at this short video that you did last week, looking at coal and particularly the issue with Germany and coal, and then we just have a little chat about some of that.
Germany's green energy and climate minister has gone on TV proposing a coal power revival to counter Russian gas cuts. Just months ago, Robert Habeck was presenting his plans on how to make Germany climate neutral by 2045. Now Moscow is turning down the gas supply to Europe. That's sending shivers of fear across the continent as it struggles to fill up its gas reserves in time for winter. Moscow says it's cutting supplies via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline between Russia and Germany to just 40% capacity, citing maintenance work. Berlin says it's all political. Restarting those coal-fired power plants is a huge setback for a greener future. The German energy minister describes the U-turn as painful, but he's not alone. Italy, Austria and the Netherlands are planning similar moves. One of Germany's governing coalition partners, the FDP, even wants to delay the nuclear phase-out, which will see Germany's last 3 atomic energy plants taken offline by the end of this year. That suggestion is currently making a lot of political noise, but it's unlikely to happen.
So, Michaela, does it make it very difficult for Germany, who is obviously holding the G7 at the moment, to be talking not just to the G7 but to these other countries and countries across the globe, that yes, Germany is still very much in favour of climate goals and want to reduce carbon emissions, while at the same time talking about having to bring all these coal back online and get back to using coal because of the issue that we're facing with this energy crisis?
Well, I think when Germany speaks to countries that are more accustomed to crisis, they understand very well, but it just puts the head of the G7 into a very awkward position. I mean, these coal power plants, they are strategic reserves. They are there exactly for cases like these without anybody actually having foreseen that this particular emergency would occur. At the same time, the government also stresses that it wants to stick with its plans to phase out coal by 2030. So that should not be touched, is what they say. But they need time to really go into overdrive. That's what they vowed to do at the very least, to build all the renewables that are necessary. And those are simply not online yet. That will take a couple of years. I've heard the German finance minister say he expects 2 to 5 years, which seems a rather long time span to me for an estimate of how long this could take, these shortages. And that's what Germany needs to get through. But yes, at the same time, the G7 presidency is sitting here and trying to persuade countries that coal is not the way to fuel your economic development. That coal should be the least best option for development and for these economies actually to reach more wealth. But that is very much understood here, particularly in Germany. That's something that Olaf Scholz does say, that he sees these countries, all countries, entitled to the same levels of wealth as the G7, and that it is the responsibility, particularly also of Germany, to help them along the way and conduct that as green as possible. But yes, that is a complete conflict that cannot be resolved.
Yes. And you did mention in that video there nuclear, but you said that that's unlikely, that Germany's not going to reverse its decision there on taking, getting rid of nuclear, getting these reactors completely offline by the end of the year. Absolutely no movement on that?
I'm glad you've set the hour aside to go into the depths of these. Well, there is no unity even in the German government whether those 3 nuclear power plants that are still online here in Germany should be extended even further. Now, the 2 parties, the largest ones, the Social Democrats and the Greens, are set it totally against a further extension beyond the end of 2022. the Free Democrats want to see that explored into more depth. And then there's the reasons given by the government is that getting those nuclear fuel rods, they say, would take at least 12 to 18 months. We've seen the Association of the Nuclear Industry say, and some producers say, and some experts say, it could take a lot less. It could take only 6 months. That's a huge difference at the moment. There is no chance for me to really verify which one is right. And then there's the argument given by the energy industry, which would make less money by investing into those nuclear power plants once again and then producing energy than it would make by firing up those coal plants. So there is an inherent interest hanging in the air there as well. And then there are security aspects with those 3 reactors that are already past the time span where they should be taken offline to have a thorough look through, a thorough security assessment already. So what would a further extension mean? And I'm no nuclear expert, but I'm just giving you all the arguments for and against, and not all of them, but those are the key ones that I've singled out that are on the table. Politically, it looks very unlikely because that would also be yet another breach of taboo for particularly the Green Party in government. They would have to do both. It's not a question of either those 3 nuclear plants or firing up coal. It would be probably a bit less coal and breaking a red line, a taboo. That's where the Green Party came from. It was the anti-nuclear movement that seems politically inconceivable. Of course, you can set against that, look, this is a war in Europe. Can there still be a political taboo? But I'm just putting it all on the table there for you.
I'm very impressed with your knowledge, Michaela, I have to say. Really very impressed. So thank you very much for explaining that all to us.
It's as brief as I could make it, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm very brief, but very interesting just where we are. But Jörg Forbrig from the German Marshall Fund, this whole issue with coal, with Germany, with climate change goals, but sort of allegations from some possibly of a bit of German hypocrisy with all of this. What do you make of it all?
Well, first of all, I would say the discussion about nuclear is interesting because apart from perhaps the economic aspects, the investment logics and so on, and the legal regulatory aspects of it, I think there is one question that doesn't resolve because we have 3 nuclear power plants still on the grid. They are sort of very large centralized electricity producers. We use gas, on the other hand, less for electricity production, as we also especially use it for thermal energy in order to heat households in a much more decentralized way. Larger, smaller plants across the country, especially also in many cities. Now, you don't resolve that shortage of thermal energy for households by keeping nuclear power plants alive. So there is a bit of a disconnect here in this discussion for me. Obviously, nuclear is the much more problematic issue, especially also for one of the coalition partners with the Green Party. But my understanding is there's also this functional distinction between gas-fired plants and nuclear power plants, where you don't necessarily resolve much of the issue of a gas shortage by keeping nuclear power plants on the grid. So I think this is a discussion that misses one of those key points. How much of the problem do you actually sort of manage to control by keeping nuclear power plants alive for another year or so?
Yeah, so you can see it is a big debate here in Germany still, and looks like it's not going to go away, particularly given what's happening in Ukraine. Just while we're still talking about climate, Michaela, there's been talk about the Climate Club, which Chancellor Scholz has raised. Can you tell us a little bit about that and whether that has become an issue at the G7?
Yes, well, these are all concepts that kind of reach into each other. The Just Energy Transition Partnership is an element of the climate club just as much as vice versa. What Olaf Scholz is creating here, and his chief advisors stress that it's still early days for this, which is interesting. Just shows you how much the G7 presidency's plans against climate change were thrown off the rails by the war, because they're saying this is, still in its very early stages. Well, this was kind of the poster project of the whole G7, and it's to bring willing countries together to recommit to actually implementing the Paris Agreement, the commitments that they've made, staying definitely below 2%, 2 degrees rise in temperature, aiming for 1.5%, but there's no sums pledged to this. And this is where the transition partnership kind of comes into it. It is more kind of a forum to create an inclusive club, and there will be, and that's accepted by all sides, there must be an element of some kind of transfer, some kind of financial incentive, some kind of reward incentive as well, to stay very closely to your climate commitments. But my impression was, having spoken to the key advisors, they simply aren't quite there yet. So I would expect that to be, let's put it this way, the invitations are already sent out to everybody for the grand opening of the Climate Club, but the roof isn't quite yet on it.
A lovely analogy, thank you. We have had some questions coming in, which are a little bit scattered, but one of them is on nuclear. And as we've just been talking about that for quite a lot over the past few minutes, I just put this to either of you. Joseph De Gorgio asks, given that nuclear is the cleanest and most productive form of energy, why would climate activists be against it? Who would like to take that one on? Oh, I love the way Jörg has turned to you, Michaela. I don't know whether...
I'll be happy.
The green movement emanated, actually long before there were the levels of climate awareness we have right now. The green movement emanated from out of the anti-nuclear movement. And if you say it is the cleanest, that is true in terms of CO2 terms. But radioactivity is hardly clean. And that was really quite a turning point, not just in the chancellorship of Angela Merkel, the Fukushima disaster that she said proved that even a high technology country cannot keep this under control. Now, even if you don't have a nuclear disaster, that is the anti-nuclear argument. There are countries in Europe, particularly France, who really, really heavily invest in nuclear energy and will also do in the future. So there are very different views. Europe is very much split on this. You have to put those nuclear fuel rods somewhere for thousands of years. You need to keep them safe. And a lot of them, first of all, they also come from Russia. I mean, just if the energy independence argument comes into this as well, the fuel rods used in Germany came from Russia. I can now say in the past. So there's your next energy dependence, although you can get them elsewhere as well, but they're not just, you can't just get them off the shelf. But they need to go somewhere in the end, and they will be radioactive for thousands of years. Is that clean, question mark? So we can have a philosophical discussion on that as well.
Do you want to come in on that?
That was exactly the answer.
Oh, well, perfect. We've got agreement. Wonderful. Look, we are coming to the end of this YouTube live Q&A talking about the G7, which is being held in Bavaria as we speak. We have our chief political editor, Michaela Küfner, who is there for us. And with me in the studio, I have Jörg Forbrig from the German Marshall Fund. You have been putting a few questions in the chat. Thank you very much. Some of them I've asked. Here's a bit of a scattergun approach to both of you. So I'll just ask you some of these before we end this chat. Simon Marshall asks, is the perceived hesitancy of Germany to supply Ukraine with heavy weapons accurate or due to real logistic issues, should I say? Let me ask Jörg, you that first.
Happy to go ahead. I would say in the first place, it's a question of political will. And in the second place, it's a question of also material availability. Now, the second part of that is relatively easy to answer. I mean, we're coming out of 20 years where the Bundeswehr was basically going through an austerity period. There was very little investment. There aren't huge stockpiles of equipment that the Bundeswehr has. Not everything is there in large enough a supply and available at the Bundeswehr in order to share it with Ukraine. And I think this is something we learn now. We now learn also through this issue how little we actually can give away by the looks of things, how much underinvested the Bundeswehr has been over the last, well, certainly 20 years.
Which we just have to say is the German army for anyone who's
precisely.
Sure.
And the second, I think, is a question of political will. We have seen countries in Europe move very fast, mobilizing whatever they have in order for Ukraine to be equipped with that. I mean, Poland is certainly the best example here, but Germany has found it very, very difficult to move at a similar pace. It's taken forever to find the things that can be shared with Ukraine. It's been taken forever to make deals with countries that could supply Ukraine with older weaponry in order to get something more modern from Germany. So these chains that have been created, it seems that took forever. It's basically only a week or two ago that the first pieces of heavy equipment, a number of howitzers, artillery systems, were supplied to Ukraine. There's an announcement that an air defense system will be supplied, that multi-launch rocket systems will be supplied. So it simply feels as if the political will wasn't strong enough and the administrative capacity, perhaps, in order to move faster. But the principal problem remains. There's only so much that this country can apparently give away.
Yeah, and Michaela, we've already talked about some of the polling in Germany, that a lot of people are very unhappy about this whole issue of supplying weapons anyway.
They're not unhappy about it. I didn't say that. What they're saying is that they don't share the assessment that the Chancellor is too hesitant. There is a majority for supplying weapons. But what I just want to recap, I mean, we saw Joe Biden praise Olaf Scholz's leadership. And it always comes down to the Zeitenwende speech, where he declared a new era just 3 days after Russia attacked Ukraine. And his reflex was to spend an extra 100 billion on German defense and to declare this complete policy turnaround. But and more shifted in that speech than in the past 20 years before that. The whole strategic outlook that Germany is now investing heavily in its own defense. Forget the 2% goal, that no longer really is an issue. That was a commitment to that. Mm-hmm. The reflex was not that Germany will immediately send all it has. And it was not that Germany will immediately send heavy weapons. That took a while. So the argument from the German side is, look, we shifted so huge in position, but at the same time, the whole policy towards Russia became apparent. It was apparent that it was a complete delusion in the past, and the Social Democrats, the party where Olaf Scholz comes from, that is a party that is seen traditionally as a party that seeks a partnership with Russia. And that's what he's up against within his own party. So I don't want to I don't want to judge on the hesitancy issue. It's not my role. But what Olaf Scholz has already done and will probably do is, in the future, goes against the forces of gravity within his own party. So I'd leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you. Quickly, because we're coming to the end, and I do want to get through some of these other questions. So very briefly.
I would just add to that I mean, giving a speech is one thing. The Zeitenwende is something you actually have to do.
Yeah.
So I think the jury is still out whether the Zeitenwende will actually happen as announced, or whether it will be watered down, whether it will be delayed. So I think I would place a little less emphasis on the actual speech, which was important, which was a breakthrough, which was a very principled departure from older positions. But whether or not this is actually going to happen as announced is something we'll still have to see.
Watch this space. OK, Michaela, very briefly, because we haven't got long, we are being asked by Samarth Kumar, any possibility of expanding the G7 to better represent global democracies? And it comes off a question about India and how important India has been in these talks.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. This is not on the table here. There are very intense talks with Narendra Modi. That's what I've learned, that they've taken place behind the scenes. There certainly won't be a G8 again, because Russia used to be part of the club and got thrown out. Not here, not now, but good point.
Another watch this space. You wanted to
on that issue, I think what's important is to keep in mind that there is a G20.
Yeah, which is coming up in the autumn.
And there's quite a bit of a sort of
but that's not democracies. That's
G7
economic.
That's correct. But there seems to be a bit of a sort of mismatch between the G7 and the G20 beyond the democracy, non-democracy divide, because it seems that the US are basically staking very much on the G7, whereas the Europeans would like to see a much stronger involvement of the G20 also. So there is a bit of a contrast that we also saw emerging at Elmau about these groupings. So
and with Putin saying that he's prepared to go to the G20.
Precisely, because Russia is a member of the G20.
Yeah. Moving on, because I just want to ask you these other questions. This one's to you, Jörg. Faith Virtue asks, we talked about it a bit earlier, but why is Lithuania trying to provoke conflict by blockading Kaliningrad? The EU is telling Lithuania to lift the blockade, but Lithuania is refusing. Is that correct, that last bit?
It's not. Lithuania is implementing EU sanctions. There is obviously a sort of special situation here because it's transit between two parts of Russia via an EU country. But fundamentally, this is an EU sanction that Lithuania implements, and this has also been acknowledged by the EU leadership. So this is where the EU has Lithuania's backs, but because it is such a critical lifeline also for this Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, there is an effort to get this under control and to make sure that this is something that doesn't spiral out of control and lead to the next escalation. In this case, then involving directly one or more EU and NATO member states.
Yeah, a very real problem out there. Michaela, I know you just said no to that, but I wanted to ask you another question. This has come from Abdelani. Sorry, but we're just sort of running out of time here. He has said, will cannabis be a topic in this G7 summit? The reason being, he says, Germany is about to legalise, and parts of the US and Canada have already legalised it. It could be a big economy boost, and they could work together there as well. Now, I know that's a bit mean to throw that at you. It's not something that I've heard talked about, but is there you can maybe just give me a no on that question, or maybe you have more of an insight than I do.
Cannabis is not. Cannabis is not on the agenda. I have not heard it mentioned, and there's no indication that it is being consumed at this G7 summit. And just on the sanctions, I just want to add, also with Kaliningrad, but also globally, food and medicines, and that almost leads us to cannabis, as a drug is not part of sanctions. So food is being transported, like daily goods can pass through easily. It is other goods that can be used militarily, but also it is building materials, and then there's also a sea link between Kaliningrad and Russia. So it's not like Kaliningrad is being completely cut off, and it's not like international sanctions have stopped food from getting supplied.
Okay, thank you very much for that explanation. I think that would be very useful to the person who was asking that question. So thank you very much for that. So I'm just going through to see if we've got any other questions. We have got one, but I'm worried that you both might take too long to answer it. But I'll try. Please try to keep it short. This is from Louisa. Michaela, which kind of peace solution will the G7 aim for? That is a hard one. Can you answer that briefly? You can say I don't know.
The short answer is the one that is acceptable to Ukraine and that lets Vladimir Putin understand that he needs President Zelensky to implement any kind of agreement, whatever it may be in the end.
Thank you. Lovely and brief. Jörg, do you have an answer to that?
Well,
or any idea?
Certainly nothing that is above that is agreed above the heads of the Ukrainians. Unless Ukraine is at the table as part of the solution, we cannot continue to put Russia's interests above those of its neighbors, including Ukraine. We've done that for long enough, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much. And that is the end of this live chat that we've been talking about the G7, which is being held in Bavaria. And we have Michaela Küfner, who is there for DW News. She's the chief political editor. She has been fascinating, explaining things that we didn't know lots, for example, about nuclear. And it's amazing how much information you have about things, Michaela. A source of all knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's been a long time, but it's been absolutely fascinating. And we look forward to what else you will be reporting on DW News, on TV, as well as YouTube. And a big thank you to you, Jörg, for keeping me company here, for making sure that we're staying on track and that we're talking about the right things. Thank you very much for, again, taking the time to talk to us. And we covered a whole load of different issues there. Some of them, obviously, your proper area of expertise, and some of them more general. So thank you very much for pitching in with all of that. And a big thank you to everyone on YouTube who's been watching us. And thank you very much for all your questions. Hopefully we managed to ask them and answer them as well. And we look forward to speaking to you again. Have a very good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are.